Paul's view won out, and his opponents failed.
Caller, you live on the air. Please tell us your name, where you're calling from.
Yeah, William, I was asked why several of the disciples didn't like Paul. James did not like him. I think Peter had conflict with him, but James of all. I honestly believe that James had more together than any of them, than any of the disciples. But is this possibly why they didn't get along with each other? Because of his deception?
All right. That's a great question. Go ahead and hang up now. You can tune in for your answer.
There could be a question about many episodes that we find in the Christian Bible, New Testament, but there are some that are no doubt historical, and one of them is that Paul's opponents were fellow Christians. In fact, in all of Paul's letters, the people that he opposed were fellow Christians. In fact, he says it himself in Galatians, a letter no doubt written from the hand of Paul. He declares that, in fact, he opposed Peter to his face for acting as a hypocrite, behaving in one way when he was around those of the Jerusalem church not willing to eat with Gentiles, and behaving in a completely different way. It's interesting that the charge that Paul levels against Peter in Antioch is precisely for behaving in the way that Paul advertises he behaves in. Paul says that this is in fact his own practice. This is probably what bothered him so much, is that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 20, 21, Paul says that he behaves in a completely different way around Jews and non-Jews. To the Jew, I become as a Jew, or one under the law, so I may gain those that are under the law. To those who are not under the law, I become as one not under the law, that I may gain those that are not under the law. I become all things to all men, that by some means I may gain some. There's no question that Paul was attacked by fellow Christians. And as it turns out, it's very rare in Paul's writings that he comes under attack from non-Christians. That means in contrast, in the gospel, you have an ongoing narrative where Jesus is confronted by non-Christian Jews. But in the letters of Paul, Paul's confrontation is with fellow Christians who held a different Christology. And we're told in the book of Acts that Paul was called into town by the Jerusalem church on the accusation that, in fact, he was teaching not to keep the law. You can see that in Acts 21, and so on. It's really all over the place. The reason that we can be fairly certain that these events actually occurred is because it would be inconceivable that something embarrassing could be written about Paul that someone would make up. Bear in mind that you have 13 letters attributed to Paul. 7 of them are certainly from his hand. And then you have one book which the church came to believe that was written by Paul, almost certainly wasn't, but the book of Hebrews, so that's Pauline. And then you have 2 Peter, which is there to 2 Peter 3:15, to prop up Paul as someone who is speaking on behalf of God, who's a true disciple. But then you have James, on the other hand, conveys a Christology that is opposed to Paul. Now, Christians have a way of working this through, and they need to, because James is one of the 27 books in the Christian Bible, but James is conveying that you need works and that you need observance in order to be saved. That's a very different type of message than Paul is conveying. In fact, it's the opposite message that Paul is conveying. So there's no doubt that there was good reason why there were Christians who opposed the book of James. Martin Luther, a very good friend. Without Luther, I don't know what we would do. We would be lost completely. So Luther considered James to be a straw of a gospel. So James, no doubt, opposed Paul, and the purpose of the book of Acts, and we don't know who wrote the book of Acts. We are only fairly sure of one thing, that whoever wrote the book of Acts also wrote the book of Luke. So it's volume 2. If you're not sure of that, you just read the first 5 verses of both books, and you'll see why that's very much the case. It was very important to the author of the book of Acts to explain, to demonstrate that everybody is on the same page. But there's something very interesting about James. His name really is Yaakov. What's very striking is that the church sought to eradicate any semblance of Jewishness from James in a very odd way. Like, how does the name James emerge as a name for Yaakov? Yaakov, we are told, the brother of Jesus. Now, you probably think that, well, one is the Greek name, and one is his Hebrew name. It's like Saul and Paul. It isn't really at all. What's very striking about James is that in the Greek, the name James isn't used. In the Greek, the name is Yaakov. Not kidding. Or Yaakobov. That means it somehow gets to our translations and gets to, in many languages, as James. But if you go into the Greek New Testament, it doesn't say James. It says Yaakov or Yaakobov. So it became very important. I mean, imagine if he was called Yaakov in the King James Version. That would be very striking to people. So in the New Testament, when Jacob is mentioned, he's called Yaakov. And when James is mentioned, he's called Yaakov. Same name. But somehow when the translation comes along, one of these names is stripped of its Jewishness and the other one is left intact. That's completely theological. Listen very carefully. In Paul's view, the reason why there was ever a law to begin with, like why did you need a law? So the law was all a shadow of Christ for the future, and no one should have to keep the law of Moses. He says this in Colossians 2:16. No one should judge you based on what you eat, the food you eat, the drink, regarding festivals and new moons, the Sabbaths. These are all shadows, Paul says, of things to come, but the substance is Christ. That's Paul's theology straight away. So Paul's doctrine is that the laws that we see in the so-called Old Testament and the law of Moses, that's only a foreshadow. In substance, they're not permanent. Everything is pointing to Jesus. Everything is pointing to Christ. That idea would not be unique to Paul, but that would seep itself into the idea would creep into the Gospels. You'd find the same sort of idea in Luke 24:44, where basically it's all speaking about Jesus. But Paul held that the keeping of the law was only all a foreshadow of things to come. And this idea is conveyed again and again in the book of Hebrews. In fact, the book of Hebrews is given over completely as an argument against Judaism, and how all the things of the past are only foreshadowing Jesus. Even the whole sacrificial system never had any. How could the blood of bulls and goats really atone for sin? It can't really do that, and it's all a foreshadow of things to come, and then misquotes Psalm chapter 40, sacrifices and offerings you didn't desire, and Hebrews 10:5 says, but a body you have prepared for me, burnt offerings, sin offerings you have not required. That is just raping what it actually says in Psalm 40 for 6 and 7 or 7 and 8, depending if you're using a Christian or Jewish Bible. So what you find in the writings of Paul is that you don't have to keep the law any longer. And this, no doubt, was opposed by many Christians because Paul is fighting with Christians. When he sends a letter to the churches that he founded in Galatia, he writes, "Who bewitched you, O foolish Galatians? that you need to keep the law, meaning Paul set up churches in what is today, in Asia Minor, what is modern Turkey. He sets up churches there, and then other Christians come along and say that you have to keep the law. And Galatians, after Paul sets up his credibility in chapter 1 and 2, refers to the pillars of the church as the so-called pillars of the church, demeans Peter, and conveys that his apostleship is superior to others, and he is a Pharisee of Pharisees, after establishing that he is credible and what he has is directly from Jesus. That's what Galatians 1 and 2 is all about. He smashes into the foolish Galatians for thinking that you have to keep the law. And then for the rest of Galatians, he is slamming the law back and forth. So there's no doubt that this is historical. And Paul's view won out, and his opponents failed, meaning the church adopted Paul's Christology and abandoned the others. So Paul is very consistent on this. I'll go just one even further, which is, I think you'll find very striking. So there's a kind of an ecumenical council, the most important council of the church that's recorded in the Christian canon. In Acts chapter 15, you have the gathering of Christian leaders there, and Peter and Paul, they're all there. And the question is, there are many people who are saying, these are early Christians, that in order to become a Christian, you have to become circumcised, essentially keep the law. And it is then resolved that you don't have to keep anything but, they don't say 7 Noahide laws, but that's what it's ultimately comes down to. You can't eat the flesh of animals that are given to idols and the non-ritual laws. It's the 7 Noahide laws. And you don't have to actually become Jewish in order to become a Christian. You got what I'm saying? What is resolved in Acts 15 is that you don't have to go through a conversion to Judaism in order to become a Christian. You don't have to keep the law of Moses in order to become a Christian. That's not necessary. You only have to keep the laws that are pre-Sinaitic laws prior to Mount Sinai. So that's written by whoever wrote Luke. But in 1 Corinthians 8, when Paul is asked, can we consume the flesh of animals that were given to idols? That means, can you eat sacrifices offered to idolatry? I mean, that would be a complete abomination, absolutely forbidden to Jew or non-Jew. Anything that's related to idolatry is usur, it's completely prohibited to a person, regardless of if a person is Jew or non-Jew. Paul says, again, if you know these gods are nothing, and essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, he says you can go ahead and do that. That's forbidden completely. And not only is it forbidden, but that is completely against the resolution that we find in Acts 15. And Paul is teaching in Romans 7. That's a chapter that's given to addressing Jews. Well, Paul is writing to churches in Rome, a church that he had never yet visited. He will. But at the time of the writing, he had not been there, and he urges Jewish people, his brethren, not to keep the law. So, and he uses a metaphor of someone whose spouse had died. So the key is that there was enormous division between the church that was headed by James, the Jerusalem church, and Paul. And Paul's most frequent interlocutors, if we look at the Christian Bible, is very clear his fellow Christians that held a different Christology. And what occurs essentially, well, how did Paul win? Well, there are many reasons why Paul would have won. It's a lot easier to go down the Paul route than the other route. You don't have to keep the commandments, but you can join the covenant and be one in the body of Christ. But what happened essentially is that the Christian movement ceased to attract Jews in the 50s. By the time we're coming to the letters of Paul, it's basically, it's all former pagans, not Jews who are becoming Christians. Christianity is a term not used in the Christian Bible, and the term Christian or Christians is found 3 times in the Christian Bible, never used by Christians. It's used by others. But whatever they call themselves, conventionally, we'll call them Christians. It is by the 50s, that's when all the letters, the indisputed letters of Paul are written. It's a Gentile issue, meaning it's former pagans that are joining the religion. So at that point, they went out, meaning it's the Gentiles who convert to Christianity, make up by far the greatest segment of Christians, and therefore Paul's Christology is certainly going to win out. So James is crushed, his name is even changed, and his Christology is disregarded or reinterpreted by the church. The book is retained, although there were some Christians, prominent Christians, who didn't feel great about that, the inclusion of James, the book of James, into the canon. But in 367, it was listed as one of the books in the canon and remained there. And Paul's Christology won over. So that's a really great question. Thank you so much.